Yeah, hello, Malcolm Rayan, and this is episode 8 of the Vegans for Palestine podcast. As anti-Zionism grows among Jewish communities, several of these communities have held sedars during Passover, or Pesach, with a focus on expressing solidarity with the people of Palestine. In this episode, Dalal has an interesting chat with Sophie, a vegan who is part of a group called Zeta Collective, which is an intergenerational, anti-colonial, and anti-Zionist Jewish group. Sophie describes Pesach in detail in relation to their veganism, Judaism, and anti-Zionism.
So my name is Sophie. I currently live in Sydney, Australia, which is the unceded Gadigal and Mongol land. I'm Jewish and I was raised in Jewish communities in the UK, but also in Australia. My maternal grandmother's family were Jews from Eastern Europe, and my maternal grandfather's family were Tunisian Jews. My father is South Asian and he's an adult convert to Judaism. I myself am strongly opposed to Zionism, and I'm also vegan, and I've been vegan for 15 years now.
And why did you go vegan? 15 years is it's an impressive journey, I'm sure, with a lot of experiences there in it. So tell me more about that and why you chose veganism.
I was raised in a household where we didn't really eat very much meat. We ate fish, but we otherwise didn't eat meat, and largely because of the preference of my parents, but also because of kosher dietary laws making it more, it's more complicated for the kitchen to have meat and dairy in the same house, and so some people will choose to just not have meat in the house to avoid that. So I didn't really grow up eating a lot of meat generally anyway. As a teenager, I had quite a few friends at school who were vegan, and so I spending time with them and listening to, what they had to say and their experiences and why they chose to be vegan. I think it sort of took me to a place of learning more about the world and learning more about where, food comes from, and factory farming in particular, and what that involves, because before that I wasn't really aware of any of these things. I think that's true of a lot of people. Even if they might know on a very surface level, I think even before that I didn't know, even on a surface level I had no idea really where any of these things came from. And I think for me that was like an opening into understanding more about how everyday things in the world are not always what they seem to be. Like, again, like that surface level understanding of how the world works. This was kind of like, for me, looking beneath the surface a little bit and realizing that what I thought was true maybe wasn't. And that's not, I guess that was also like not just for, where food comes from, but also like, how our clothes are made and how capitalism oppresses people as well as animals, and how those things all came to be connected to each other. So I think it's been a long journey of trying to understand that and how these things fit together. But I think that's kind of where it started.
And having the dairy products with the meat in the same kitchen, and given that you're also Jewish, like how did you find the intersectionality between Judaism and between veganism? How did those two philosophies come together for you?
I think it's an interesting question because I think there's a few different ways to approach it. I think you can look at sort of values within Judaism, which you can interpret as veganism being a part of that. I think you can also look at the texts, and I should say as well, I'm not a religious scholar. I'm not a person who I'm not an expert in any way. A lot of my knowledge of these things is basic, but so a lot of what I'm speaking from is like my own personal interpretation of these things, and in my personal experience many other people disagree with me. But I think so maybe I'll start off with the values of like what seems to connect to like this idea of social justice within Judaism, because I think that's sort of where I personally kind of see the intersection. So Judaism is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's a cultural practice. It's a faith. It's also an identity. It's a heritage. It can be all of those things or some of those things to all different people, and everyone's experience is different. When I think of when I consider the values that I was taught as a child and the things that I learned that I felt were aligned with my own personal values, I think about things we talk about to do with like repairing or improving the world, like making the world a better place, seeking justice and striving for a just and equitable society, and that being like a universal moral obligation. That's something that humans should strive for. There's things that relate specifically, a lot of these things relate in the way that they're described in the text relate specifically to humans, but a lot of the ways in which I interpret them is in how they relate to life in general, like this idea that all humans deserve dignity. I believe that that's the case for all beings. Like, all beings do deserve dignity. And when we talk about every life being a whole world, that's true of all life, not just human beings, for me anyway.
And I share the same perspective with you as well.
Yeah, and I think there's people who would disagree with that, across different different cultures and different faiths. But there are also people who would agree, and I think you get like I said, it's a very personal thing, and it's about like your own values and how that resonates with how you feel. But there's also a lot to do with not standing by when the safety of another is threatened. And again, for me, that's also the case for animals. We have to protect and take care of each other, and that means taking action and making our voices heard, regardless of whether or not we're personally affected or harmed by something. And so that kind of relates to this idea of mutual responsibility and doing what's right, even if you're not the person who's being harmed. So like I said, I think for me that's true for animals as well. But there's also like a big, within Judaism, I think there's this big thing about reflection and inquiry and questioning things, and that these asking questions in the pursuit of justice, that has a lot to do with challenging authority and the systems that perpetuate injustice. And so that's not just the systems that perpetuate injustice towards human beings, at least from my interpretation, but also the systems that perpetuate injustice towards animals, of which there are many, as we both know. And like I said, some people are going to think about that in terms of when they understand these values, they're going to think about them in terms of placing humans above animals. And in some cases, they're also going to interpret them as placing Jewish lives above non-Jewish lives, because there are certain ways that these texts can be interpreted to mean that. But like I said, my interpretation is that they should apply equally to all beings, and that repairing the world should not just be about bettering your own position in life. Like, it shouldn't be a selfish thing. It should, or at the expense of someone else. And I guess it would be hypocritical to me to claim that oppressing another person or animal would be consistent with this idea of striving for justice. And I think it's the idea that life is very precious, and that we should be recognizing that and valuing that above everything else. So that's like the more general, the big picture, I guess, version. But when we think more about like connecting those values, those ideas of social justice with veganism more specifically, there are some things as well within the text where they talk about avoidance of harm, not just to people but to animals. So that, like, acting with compassion and minimizing unnecessary suffering to animals specifically. And there are multiple possible ways to interpret this. The Torah doesn't forbid the eating of meat or animal products by any means, but the dietary laws are very specific. And there are people who make arguments for eating meat as having a spiritual component, sort of as part of a covenant that's made with God. And I am aware of some Orthodox Jews who primarily are vegetarian most of the time, but they will eat meat on Shabbat or on holidays, because that's as part of their personal practice. That's what they deem to be that's what's important to them. But I think, again, personally for me, my interpretation of how we repair the world, of how we improve it, like when we're trying to do that, is eating meat really necessary for this? For me, I don't think that's the case. And it's clear that things like factory farming cause immense suffering to animals, and some people's version of trying to live those values means choosing animal products specifically, that are not from factory farms or from other places. But my personal choice is to be vegan, because I feel like that's the most that I can do in order to minimize that kind of harm. There are obviously many practices like ritual sacrifice that we no longer regularly perform, and there are other symbolic gestures, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about Pesach, that we use or eat instead. And sometimes those symbolic foods are animal products, but they don't necessarily have to be. Like, there are many different traditions that exist in many different places, and those have changed over time, over thousands of years. I think it's possible for us to adapt, the way that we practice these things to the world that we live in today, and do that in a way that shows kindness and compassion for animals and for people, and a recognition that there are actually different choices available to us now than there were before. And I also recognize that, doing these specific things and eating some of these specific foods are very important to some people, and that's an important part of their practice. But like I said, it's very personal, and these things haven't remained static. Like, we can see over thousands of years that these have changed, and I think that means that there is room for us to change if that's something that we choose to do.
I see how this the value aspect of Judaism is also present in the monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The past month and over the past couple of weeks, Muslims have been fasting, and at the same time, Christians are fasting, and we already celebrated Eid al-Fitr, and also you will be celebrating Pesach and also Easter for the Christian community as well. And these different celebrations and traditions in the religions also they require certain observing and standing to certain values and but at the same time what you mentioned about the values is of pondering and thinking and reflecting on life through the texts that we study in the different monotheistic religions. I see that as a sign that this is a way for people to remain guided or to remain consistent with what they practice and how those practices should reflect on their realities, on all sentient beings in their surroundings. But tell me a little bit more about your Jewish celebrations, especially Pesach, because it's going to be over the next few days. And how do you also observe and celebrate Pesach? And especially that there is a lot of food involved in this process, and from one aspect, and then kind of community and how you connect with your community as well.
I think, like, again, if I'm speaking about my own personal practice and how I observe and celebrate, I think that's changed over time for me personally. Like I said, growing up, I was raised in communities where we did a lot of things together, as a community, but as part of a family. A lot of these celebrations were things where we would come together as a family and we would take part in them together. So for Pesach, actually, Pesach is a week-long holiday, but for the first and the second nights, we have a Seder, which is the Seder means order, and it is there's a specific order in which the night runs, and it's quite a long night. But it's all of us. We all come together and we all sort of partake in the rituals, and we eat together, and we discuss together. And I think as a child, I don't know that I really appreciated that sort of coming together, because for me, I was like, oh, it's a very long night and I would like to have dinner, and dinner is something that happens like quite late in that time. But like now as an adult, I do really value that sort of coming together and what it means to have those conversations and to practice and eat together. Something I think that has changed for me is that when we moved to Australia, I felt there is a lot of racism in the Jewish community. That's not the bulk of what I want to talk about here, but because of that, I felt very rejected by the community that I was in. Also, increasingly as I learned more about what Zionism actually was and what it involved, I became uncomfortable with what that actually meant. And because Judaism outside of Zionism was not something that was really modeled for me and was not something that's really talked about in a lot of these communities, I sought to distance myself from all of this. And so that meant that I wasn't practicing, and I wasn't observing, and I wasn't, I kind of just withdrew from all of that because I didn't really know how to exist in that space anymore. And I think that that shifted again now. Like I do have practices now that I do have my own community that I'm with, but that in itself has been a process. And something that I really value is the fact that we do come together and we do have community events, and we do sort of try to reframe all of these traditions and these festivals and our understanding of those things in the way that we just talked about, where we think about current events, and we try to understand it from within that framework and like what these things mean to us now. But yeah, my personal practice of Judaism is no longer in the institutions in the synagogues, but maintaining these traditions is still really important to me, and doing so in a way that reflects my values is still really important to me. And so, like you mentioned, a big part of the celebrations is that we often eat specific foods on specific holidays. A lot of the time, there's a symbolic aspect to that, and a lot of these foods also aren't always vegan, so veganizing them is an important part of my practice. So it's like me trying to bring together all of those things that are part of who I am, and that there's like you said, that consistency, like living in a way that aligns with your values, but not compromising on those things, but like in a way that feels okay to you, because I think sometimes people feel like they have to, they have to give up something in order to, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. So I feel good about that. For example, I think you mentioned on Hanukkah we eat a lot of fried food, because a lot of the story of Hanukkah is around oil, and the particular story it talks about oil. So we eat a lot of fried foods, and so that's like, depending on where your family is from and what the traditions are, that which particular fried foods you might eat will be very different. I think there is a lot of focus on what the Ashkenazi traditions are, and that can be kind of the dominant narrative. I will say that even though, obviously my grandfather was not from an Ashkenazi community, I don't know much about, how he practiced a lot of these holidays. So that is kind of a sad thing for me, and it's something that I would like to, I'm trying to learn more about now, about sort of like how Jewish communities, like, what their traditional foods were, in North Africa, in Tunisia, but also in Morocco and Algeria and Libya and all of those places, because they are like, sometimes they are very specific to the place. Yeah. Same for all the holidays, for Purim, for Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, there's things that I had as a child that I really associate very strongly with those holidays. And for me, it's not just the holiday and the festivals, and they're not just about the food, but making the food is in some ways like part of the practice for me. It's so, and like I said, like we talked about before, bringing the veganism and the Judaism together in a way means like specific foods that are associated with a community, and sometimes that just means specific foods that I associate like with my family. So like, there's a particular cake that my grandma will make, and so that's something that I like to be able to make vegan as well, because I have a lot of nostalgia for it, and it makes me feel close to her as well.
You can maybe tell me about how Pesach, for instance, how you view Pesach from a liberation perspective that aligns with your advocacy for Palestine.
Pesach is a story of liberation. It's a story of people who are being oppressed, ultimately are liberated from their oppression, and that liberation is a very joyful thing. And part of the celebration of Pesach is remembering that oppression, and then also remembering that liberation. And a lot of the symbolic things that we do and a lot of the things that we talk about kind of relate to those things. But I think if we're thinking about that sort of from interpreting it through the lens of, everything that's happening today, I think it's really important to think about those stories and try to understand them in the context of our everyday lives, because that's how we learn, and that's how we grow, and that's how we try to make the world a better place. And that process of self-inquiry that we talked about, I think that's kind of key. For me, it's like that liberation is so important, and it's so key to the story, and that's what we're striving for. But that liberation can't come at the expense of anybody else. That, like, the idea that anyone could be liberated, but in the process of their liberation they could oppress another person, and specifically in this case I'm talking about like people claiming that the existence of Israel is about the liberation or the freedom of Jewish people. That liberation, that freedom can't exist as long as those same people are oppressing Palestinians. And so I think, if it's specifically thinking of Pesach in the context, the genocide that Israel is committing right now, and Palestine, and how all those things are connected, I think that's a really important thing for me to remember when we observe this festival. The roles are not always static. That if people can only ever see Jewish people as being oppressed and never the oppressors, we end up perpetuating the harms that we see throughout history. Like, we need to be able to understand that anyone can do harm, that anyone can be an oppressor. And choosing to not be able to see that that's a part of being human, that you have that capacity to do terrible things. I think it kind of goes against like the moral obligation of the Seder, of celebrating the holiday. We kind of haven't met those obligations. If we choose to ignore that lesson, that's how I understand Pesach in this context. I think I mentioned before that we have some symbolic foods that we eat, and that's the case for lots of holidays. On Pesach, there are many different symbolic foods that we eat, and we have a plate that we have at the Seder, and many of those foods go on the plate, and they sit in the middle of the table, and we see them in the middle, but we also talk about them, and they're a part of the order of how the night goes, as we eat some of those foods, and we interact with some of those foods, and we talk about them. And two of the foods on the Seder plate are like what most people would use, are not things that are traditionally vegan. So there's a roasted egg and there's also a shank bone. The roasted egg represents the festival sacrifice, and also for some people in sort of the cycle of life and rebirth, and also the mourning for the destruction of the temple. So that a lot of these symbols sort of have multiple meanings as well, depending on the interpretation. And the shank bone, that represents the Passover sacrifice, so the lamb whose blood was used to mark the doorposts so that they would be spared from the final plague, the death of the firstborn, so the angel would pass over those houses and not firstborn Jewish children would not be harmed by that plague. Previously, we have information to say that those foods in particular were not always the things that were used for those symbolic foods. So I think, some in the time of the Talmud, there were other things. I think one of the sages mentions radish and rice as being potentially things that you could substitute instead. I've also heard people say potato and beetroot, for example, for those two things. And when at home, my own personal experience was, we didn't, like I said, we didn't have meat other than fish in the house. So for the shank bone on the Seder plate, my mum would actually make one out of paper and tape, because again, it was very much a symbol, and it's not something, the shank bone is not something that you eat usually anyway. There are other symbolic foods that you do eat, but this one is actually just something that is on the plate that we look at and talk about. So in that case, it wasn't actually a food. It was more of an object that was being that symbol. Yeah, so some interpretations are purely symbolic and not necessarily food-based. I think probably the only other thing that I wanted to mention was depending on the tradition that you grow up in and what your family does, there's when we more restrictions on what we would eat during the time when we are celebrating Pesach, during that holiday, which lasts for just over a week or just over a week. And mainly that has to do with not eating 5 grains. So I think that's wheat, barley, oats, rye, and spelt. I think those are the 5 grains that we don't eat. But there's some traditions, there are other things that are grains or legumes and seeds as well. That includes things like rice and corn and peas. But there's a very, very long list of what's considered kitniot, which is they're not permissible, but for some communities, the tradition is that those things are not permissible. And traditions where kitniot are permissible, I think it's actually very easy to be vegan during Pesach, because a lot of these things like tofu and legumes and grains and seeds are things that are normally a part of our diet. So even if we are not eating those other grains, that it's pretty straightforward. Lentils are okay, tofu's okay, beans are okay. Traditions where kitniot are forbidden, which is largely Ashkenazi, but there are also some other communities, the non-Ashkenazi communities, where they also don't permit kitniot, or at least some kinds of those things. It obviously depends on the specific community and specific tradition. It can be quite difficult to find vegan protein, because a lot of the food for Pesach is quite heavy in, especially the desserts as well, are quite heavy in egg, just to replace all of the grains that they're not using. And since tofu is not permitted, because soybeans are considered kitniot, that does limit the options. I know that in those communities, potato and quinoa and nuts and other vegetables are okay. So kind of when you are thinking about trying to keep kosher for Pesach, but also in a vegan way, sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult just because of those specific restrictions. But I also know that some Ashkenazi communities now do consider kitniot permissible, but that's relatively recent. And I think it depends on the specific tradition within those communities. The Orthodox communities it's not permissible for them, but for at least many of the Reform and conservative Jewish communities, Ashkenazi communities, they do consider it permissible now. But some people, even though the rabbis have said, yes, you can have this, because that's not their tradition, that doesn't feel right to them. So I think everyone has to kind of do what makes sense for them personally. If they don't feel comfortable doing that, but they still want to make it work, that there are things they can do, like quinoa, even though it's a grain, just because it's new, it's relatively new. It's not new, but to the people for whom who are making these decisions about what's permissible and what's not permissible, I think for many of those people, quinoa was previously considered kitniot, and then they changed their minds about it. So again, there's lots of disagreement about what's okay and what's not okay. I think now a lot of people will say quinoa is okay if it's certified kosher for Pesach. Like I said, it's a very personal choice. I think everyone should consider what makes sense for them and their own situation from a religious and cultural perspective, but also from the perspective of taking care of their own health and doing what aligns best with their values.
As a Palestinian, and this is what I mentioned like at another time to you, that around celebrations, around the Jewish holidays, we experience oppression in how the roads are closed and there are even stricter checkpoints under the pretext that this is to secure the safety of the Jews. Although, like around us, the settlements are already existing in a way that they're separating Palestinians from each other and causing even more checkpoints and more land confiscation for the sake of that security claim. But then with holidays specifically, I would see more road closures and more checkpoints and more restrictions in the way that it aims at disrupting Palestinians in their daily lives, but at the same time ensuring that the celebrations are ongoing. And I'm sure that people, the more maybe they try to get educated, they would maybe try to see things from a different perspective and consider that one people's celebration could be another people's agony and suffering. So
no, and thank you for sharing that perspective, because I think that is important, because that's the part that a lot of people either they don't see or they choose not to see. And yeah, someone's celebration should not harm anyone else like that. We know that, but obviously not everyone else does. So thank you for sharing that as well. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you also for sharing your experience as well. And I really hope that the community that you are connecting with now can be the community that you feel really that you fit in or belong in. I should say fit, but really like it's the community that you really want or see yourself connecting with.
When I'm trying to support, businesses that are sourcing products, sourcing raw materials more ethically, whether or not it's to do with how I think about how we can support communities who are, human beings who are oppressed across the world, and that includes, people in Palestine. I think all of these things, like I said before, all of these things are connected. When I think about those values, I kind of feel like they all relate to each other. Obviously can't claim to be perfect. I think everybody's trying their best in a very imperfect world, in a world that is not set up for us to always make ethical choices, or sometimes what is an ethical choice or what is a more ethical choice is obscured because of the way in which how the raw materials are sourced, or like how a product is made, or whether or not people are paid fairly for their labor, or whether or not things are made on stolen land, and whether or not businesses obviously are operating on stolen land. Sometimes that information is not immediately obvious, and so we have to do the work to find that out. But so I think for me, all of this is like a process. I'm learning. It's important for me to continue doing the self-reflection and inquiry, to continue to consider all of these things and continue to learn more about it, because obviously there are many things that I still don't know very much about, and there are many things that I have learned in this time. And I'm just trying to continue to build on that. And I think that in some ways, to me, that feels like a very core part of how I see, how I understood Judaism to be, in terms of that constant state of learning, if that makes sense.
But what the fuck are anti-Zionist Jews gonna do during Passover this?
We're gonna do the same thing we did last year, which is read the story and talk about it and discuss what it means in modern times.
You know what I want? I'm a Jew, right? I want to be able to go and pray at the Western Wall. And I want to be able to pray there next to my Palestinian friends, Muslims and Christians, in peace and freedom. It's not possible. I don't want to pray under a gun that occupies and oppresses the indigenous people of Palestine.
People did not just become anti-Zionist Jews this year. People have been anti-Zionist Jews for years and have been holding anti-Zionist seders and use the story of Exodus to talk about how we now as people can advocate for freedom and safety for Palestinian people and for all people in the world.
If I may, just to say, it's something that it's important for me to say as an Israeli, as a Jew.
Go ahead.
We have this command in Judaism: you shall not stand over the blood of your neighbor. And for me, I don't see the Palestinians and the Gazans as my neighbors. I see as my own people. And I say it with tears, because what happened today, my family is Iraqi. They are Iraqi Jews. When I see grandmothers and grandfathers in Gaza begging for food. I see them in my own eyes, and this is not something that we condemn it and we have to stop it. And this is our moral obligation to fight with our own people, with our own blood, in order to tell them what you're doing is wrong.
I don't want to go to parties as people went to parties on October the 7th, 5 miles away from an open-air prison in which 2.2 million people are penned in without access to sufficient food and water. So I don't want that status quo.
We have to stop this war. We cannot let this bloodshed continue.
I do also see the same journey as you're describing. I mean, I come from a Muslim community here in Palestine, but it's I think the very first time you go vegan, I mean, I don't know, but for me, I just turned vegan because I didn't find any reason to eat animals, and it's throughout the last years I have been just unpacking and questioning and inquiring and just scratching all the surfaces and behind what's deep inside, like the community and the way, like where the food comes from, what's there on the table, and trying to find that connection between the food and the land and the history and the traditions. Because as you're describing, like for me also, food is just beyond what you really eat. It's there is a lot of history and traditions and practices there that are connected to it, and at the same time it's again a way to guide you, because as someone described before, it's like the moral compass that guide you through how you navigate your surroundings and how you connect with people from different backgrounds or communities. It's fair and logical that if you're vegan and you're standing by and you believe in all lives are precious and should be preserved, it makes the sense that you also fight for the same like values for Palestine and other communities as well that are facing genocide and different shapes and forms of occupation. And I probably want to go and revisit what you touched quickly on Zionism, and because I do understand how it can be very difficult at some times for you to maybe differentiate and maybe try to get people to understand that being a Jew and Judaism is totally different from Zionism, because we easily like hear different accusations here and there of this being anti-Semitic. Or how would you maybe just like in short distinguish between the two, or maybe explain what that means actually?
It's tricky because it depends on who I'm talking to as to how I would address it. I think there are definitely people who have misconceptions, but they're open to dialogue and they're open to understanding and maybe shifting their perspective. And there are people who are arguing for the sake of arguing. For me, when people say, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, or, whatever misconception that they have about what it means to support Palestine, especially for a Jewish person to support Palestine as well, because I think a lot of people see those things as being incompatible, which obviously is not the case, but that's obviously a big misconception that exists. For me, I want to bring it back to them that they are conflating Judaism and Zionism. Judaism is very old. Zionism is very young. At the time when Zionism first, became more prominent, it wasn't necessarily very popular. It didn't have a lot of support. It didn't really gain the kind of level of support that it did until after the Second World War. And, for a bunch of different reasons, that it gained the support that it did, and it kind of continued to have that support. And from that stage, it's been very convenient for Zionists, for everyone to see Judaism as Zionism, because anytime anyone criticizes Zionism or anything that Zionists do, they can then clap back with, oh, but if that's anti-Semitic. And, real anti-Semitism does exist. And I think it's actually very disingenuous to point at, critiques of Israel and say that doing so, like that any critique of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic, like that Israel is somehow above reproach. Like I think that also to me is antithetical to all that those ideas of inquiry and reflection and challenging authority. Like why shouldn't we be able to criticize things that we can see that we know are wrong? And obviously some people are choosing to ignore the truth about this so that they don't have to engage with that. But why is this an exception? Why Why are people choosing not to do that inquiry and self-reflection about this particular thing? And I think that's a really important thing for people to reflect on, although many of the ones, people who don't want to are not going to choose to do that, whether or not they're Jewish people who feel very personally about this because they consider themselves to be Zionists, or because they're non-Jewish people who have interests in supporting Israel, whether or not those are political interests, whether or not those are other interests. I think, and this for me, this is one of the misconceptions that's really tied to this conflation of Judaism and Zionism, is this idea that people say, oh well, Israel needs to exist. Israel exists to protect Jews from anti-Semitism. It's obvious to me that Israel needs anti-Semitism to justify its own existence. And if that means manufacturing anti-Semitism or actively encouraging anti-Semitism, that seems to be what they're happy to do. And like I said, anti-Semitism certainly exists in other contexts, but when Israel claims to act on behalf of all Jewish people while committing a genocide, while oppressing Palestinians, while doing all of the hateful things that that the state is doing, that actively encourages hatred of Jewish people. And I think there are some people who they don't realize that, and there are some people, I think, they cynically do realize that, but they believe it's for a purpose, and so that they're happy to keep stoking these fires. But it's a very dangerous game they're playing, and to claim they're doing it to protect anyone it's just clearly not true from my perspective.
And I understand how the anti-Semitism is like the term was recently changed to even suit the settler colonial agenda, and how they try to justify what they're doing in Palestine, or the silencing of the pro-Palestine voices across the world. And we're seeing the present examples of what's happening in the States, for instance, or even with the ones who you, like, from your experience, would tend to show their interest in having an actual conversation or be actually open to the discussion. Like, does it actually change a lot? I mean, from a vegan perspective, I know throughout my personal experience that oftentimes people simply want to attack you as a vegan because you probably trigger that insecurity of them not actually understanding their religious practices or what they actually claim to stand by. They will justify things by, because Allah said this is permissible, the book said that this is permissible, so and it's halal, so why do you say otherwise? But they take the conversation to different directions, actually, and it's very disorienting, and it dismisses a lot of the actual components, what we could potentially address from a logical point of view. But yeah, when it's about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, anti-colonialism, things are very politically centered, and oftentimes people simply would throw the word anti-Semitism in the conversation just to kill it. But even in those conversations, how far can you actually change? How far can you bring to, like, the conversation of the awareness, of the understanding, or at least trying to build a sense of understanding between to get people to understand the values and the justifications that you would try to communicate.
I think that's a really good analogy there, because I think I can see I think that it's a similar way in which people feel like almost that they feel personally attacked, that they feel like they have to engage with you because they feel very upset by what it is that you're doing, like that what you're doing somehow harms them, even though it's your own personal choice. And obviously, like in both cases, we both know like what it is that we care about and why we care about it, but sometimes when people are coming to us to question us about this, they want to undermine that. And I think, like, when it comes to conversations about Zionism and anti-Zionism, and when people talk about, that I'm betraying the Jewish community by supporting Palestine, or like, it's tricky. In my experience, I think in some ways, like you said, it's similar to the conversations about veganism, the conversations about, what the cruelty that people inflict upon animals in order to get meat, in order to make other products that are made from animals. Unfortunately, there's only so far that you can take the conversation, kind of like what you said. If somebody is open or maybe questioning already, I think that's a good entry point. That's a way you can start having the conversation. But what I have noticed, and I think that's also my own experience as well, is that people people sometimes will hit a bit of a wall, even if they are open to some degree. Sometimes there is a bit of a wall that they'll hit, and everyone takes their own amount of time to come to terms with those things. Some people never do. Some people will stop there. For them, that's the limit, and they don't want to push past that further for whatever reason. And for some people, it's a very slow process where over time, they might have one conversation and then, they find that distressing and they have to think about it, and they might shift a little bit from that conversation, and then they'll learn more, and then they'll have another one, and it will, it's quite a long process. And then there are other people who, they might have one, and I don't think this is as common, obviously, where they might have one conversation and, it might not change their mind immediately, but it might shift their perspective enough that they see things in a different light. And I think for a lot of people, especially when it comes to that conversation about, whether, what anti-Zionism is and what anti-Semitism is, and whether, for some people, that means basically turning what they know upside down. And that doesn't mean that it isn't really good and important for them to do it, but I think they do need some time to re-understand, to reinterpret all of those things that they thought that they knew, and try to process that knowledge in a way that is productive, that's good for them. And I say good for them in the sense that they can then take that and do something with it, because I think some people will then take that knowledge, whether or not they feel constrained by the communities that they're in, whether or not they feel constrained by the views of their family members, or that they have fears about what that knowledge will, or speaking out about that knowledge will do. I think some people kind of hold that inside, and they choose not, or whether or not they feel like it's a choice. It is on some level, it's a choice that they make, but they hold it inside, and they don't have any way of acting on it. And I think in that way, it also harms them, because to have that knowledge and to have that shift in perspective, but not be able to feel like you can do anything, or not be able to have community with people, or have people who understand where you're coming from, I think that can be a very hard thing for people, and it can cause them to kind of retreat in a way. Like maybe they know that these things are wrong, but they fall back into them because they don't know of another way of being. So I think for me, it's like, even if people can't hear what I'm saying right now, if they know that other people who feel that way exist, if one day when they get there, they know that I'm here and I'm ready to talk to them.
The following poem is called I Cannot Write a Poem About Gaza, which is written by a Samoan artist by the name of Tusaida Avia. This poem is read by May, who is a Scottish anti-Zionist Jewish artist.
I cannot write a poem about Gaza because I cannot eat a whole desert. I cannot write a poem about Gaza because I cannot go to bed with the stiff little babies and the bodies of children. There is no room for the little lost limbs, the disembodied arms, yanked off like parts in a doll hospital. I cannot write a poem about Gaza because if I speak up for the bodies of babies, for the pieces of children, for the women pulling out their own eyes, you will call me anti-Semitic, and I must allow the blood of thousands to absolve me. I cannot write a poem about Gaza because my fury and my grief will rise up out of my chest like a missile plotted on a computer in Tel Aviv. It will track me, pinpoint me, and in a perfect arc it will wind down out of the surgical sky and to the top of my head and implode me. I cannot write a poem about Gaza because Israel has a right to protect itself, and Israel has a right to protect itself. 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 Israel has a right to protect itself, and Gaza does not. I cannot write a poem about Gaza because behind every human shield is another human shield, and another human shield, and another human shield, and another human shield, and behind that human shield is a human. I cannot write a poem because it's complicated. So complicated. Very, very complicated. So I cannot write a poem about Gaza until I finish a PhD in Middle Eastern politics and the Holocaust, until I'm reborn a Jew and live under the Iron Dome myself. I cannot write a poem about Gaza because Tamar in Tel Aviv has got to get to the supermarket in the garden centre before the next siren. She's putting plants in the bomb shelter and the kids' favourite toys and treats to make it less depressing. I cannot write a poem about Gaza because Fatima in Gaza City has 58 seconds to evacuate her house with her babies before the missile strikes, and the only way out is the sea. She's seen pictures on TV of babies thrown into pools and swimming instinctively. I cannot write a poem about Gaza because there is an impenetrable dome that covers the entire state. It covers each mind and each heart, except for the few that line up and demand to be imprisoned. I cannot write a poem about Gaza because of my friends Tamar, Shira, Yael, Michal, Noya, David, Yair in Tel Aviv and Nazareth and Beersheba, because every time I point to the blood-soaked, I upset them, offend them, anger them, betray them, let them go. I cannot write a poem about Gaza because of my friend Isaldina's 3 exploded daughters and 1 exploded niece filleted across his living room. I cannot write a poem about Gaza because I can do the maths. If 2,168 dead Palestinians divided by 69 dead Israelis equals, find the true value of 1 Palestinian.
I think it's important for us to think about these things in terms of how we can make the world a better place, and we want to stop terrible, the violence and terrible things from being enacted. Sometimes many of these things are systemic, and many of these things are outside of our individual power to change alone. And I think for some people that can be very disheartening. I think there are many different kinds of action. I think community building is a really important kind of action that sometimes gets left behind. And part of community building is, finding other people who, you don't have to agree with them on every single thing, but the core values are the things that you have these core values that you can agree on, and you're ultimately working towards a common goal, but you're also taking care of each other as part of trying to get to that common goal. And I think, obviously I'm speaking from within the context specifically of my experience of building community within Jewish communities, specifically Jewish people who reject Zionism, which I think is a growing number of people. But still, I think the way that the world works means that many of us are separated from each other. I think it's important to reach out. If you are seeking support, if you want to talk to someone, if you're struggling with this knowledge and you want to have a conversation, I think it's important to have a conversation about it with somebody who understands where you're coming from. Like, how can we work together? Whether or not we work together to fundraise, whether or not we work together to protest, whether or not we work together to do something, concrete and specific, but we also work together to be together. Because I think, there are, especially a lot of the Western ideology, there's a lot of focus on individualism and, taking care of yourself. And that works for some people to some degree. But I think especially for people who feel cast out of communities, who have grown up in communities and they've felt that connection to community very strongly or not, to feel like they don't have that anymore. And I think you don't have to recreate. We don't want to recreate the harms. That doesn't mean that community itself can't also be harmful in its own way. Like there are problems also, but we can try to take the things that we love and that sustain us and try to carry those. And just because maybe we don't have family that support or understand these values and these things that we're striving towards, doesn't mean that we can't create our own family. Because for me also, family is not just blood, it's also the people who love you and the people who care about the things that you care about. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, the part about the community, it's really tricky when even when we have community together and united, it can be united for the purposes that would be harmful to other communities that are already united, fighting for moral, just values. But I think with community, as long as the community is morally driven and that compass is taking them to fight together for the rightful justice, for the rightful and just causes, that they aim at making the change for the better of the world and for the better of other human beings, looking ahead in what's coming, or for the people who might feel they are capable of doing something, or they're also sharing the same values like yourself and mine. In how can activists actually build bridges between communities through advocacy and liberation and freedom? Because people exist in different spaces, and what might work in one community doesn't necessarily work in another. But yeah,
I think it really depends. I think building bridges comes, at least from my perspective, building bridges comes from sharing experiences with each other as well. We can have core values that are very similar. We can be striving towards a common goal, but if we're not sharing our experiences and we're not, I think sharing those experiences is part of that, building that community, and also a cross community kind of building, because I think we can create new communities by doing that, if that makes sense. The community does not have to be a single enclosed thing. We can like you said, build bridges, but we can create new communities that encompass those communities by having these shared experiences. And sometimes that, that means like interfaith or intercultural conversations, like, sharing our different or similar experiences with sort of different faiths and cultures. Sometimes that means sharing our celebration of the festivals, and because I think sometimes again these things we can become quite separated. We're doing our own things and we're doing them separately, and other people, and that I guess that's why it's important for me to talk about what, when we're talking about Pesach, we're talking about other Jewish holidays, like what they actually mean and what they're about, because I think it's not like this information is available if people want to look it up, but it's a different thing to read about something on the internet than it is to experience it as well, and also experience it through whatever interpretation is. Like, there are many different ways to interpret those holidays and to celebrate them, and peoples have very specific traditions that come from very specific places, and I think like the diversity of those experiences is very beautiful. Like, we learn so much from other people by sharing those experiences, and I think that is one of the things that can build those stronger connections and make us see also like not just the differences but also the similarities in the things that we care about and the ways in which we do practice and celebrate. But I think ultimately for me what it comes down to is having respect and recognition of each other as human beings and not just tools to achieve a purpose, because I think often the goals that we are seeking, the things we're striving for, are extremely important, but sometimes we can fail to see each other as human beings, even our own selves. We stop acknowledging our own humanity because we are so focused on the goals. And I think we are all human beings, and we are all imperfect, and we are all trying to be better. And I think that small thing is a big thing for me when it comes to that. So yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience, and this is really a precious time that I shared with you, and wishing you peaceful, joyful celebrations and holidays ahead. And yeah, I really hope this inspires people who share the same values, and if they want to take that example and work with it in their communities, then this is your time, and just do it. Start on it. Thank you so much again. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. No, thank you for having me as well.
يا طالعين عين للجبل يا موذ لموقدين النار بين لليمن يمن عين للهنا يا روح ما بادي منك لكم خلعة ولا لا بدي ملبوس بين لليمن يمن عين للهنا يا روح ما بادي منك لكم خلعة ولا لا بدي زنار بين لليمن يمن عين للهنا يا روح إلا غزال للدي جوين لليكم محبوس بين لليمن يمن عين للهنا يا روح إلا غزال للدي جوين لليكم ميدوم بين لليمن يمن عين للهنا يا روح يا طالعين عين للجبل يا مول لموقدين النار بين لليمن يمن عين للهنا يا روح.
Free Palestine.